Hi, I'm Rhonda Fairley, and I'm going to talk to you about psychosocial development today. In particular, I'm going to talk about neurological deficits that impact psychosocial development, and later on, I'm going to get into the current research. So, to begin with, the most common neurodevelopmental disorders in children are attention deficit disorder, autism disorder, and specific learning disabilities. And they're the most common children, and they're usually diagnosed between the ages of 4 and 7, which are school, that's your school age when you first start school. So that's probably, why parents begin to notice and teachers begin to notice, there's something going on that's a little different with this child. So autism is a social communication and an interaction disorder that also is known by having repetitive disorder behaviors. It affects between 1 and 2% of the population, and currently the website on the CDC website says that 1 in 54 children will be diagnosed with autism. So when you think of autism, you may think of repetitive behaviors, just like I said. A kid can be attached to an object. They can do things like walk back and forth, over and over again. They can talk about the same topic, like even though you try to get them away from the topic, then they go back to talking about the topic. So they're kind of stuck and they're fixed on one thing. And then on the other hand, they can be so involved in what they're doing that they don't notice anybody saying their name. If you try to take the object away from them, they may become really emotional about having that object taken away, or by having to get up and move from one spot to the other. They're not really they don't like change. Routine is what they like, and that's what, where they are. So attention deficit disorder is probably the most common of all three of them, because it does affect 5% of our school population, and it's a persistent deficit that can stay with the person until through adolescence or even into adulthood. There are adults that they go to the doctor themselves and say, hey, what's going on with me? I think I have ADHD. And, with some testing and things, they find out that sure enough, they're being diagnosed with ADHD. But for my research, I wanted to focus on children, and I found out that children with ADHD are not only hyperactive and they can be impulsive, and that's kind of the things that we think about, but they're also very inattentive. They have trouble regulating their emotions. They can become upset at the change in routine, or like if they're trying to do something and they figure out that they can't quite do it the way they want to, then they can become upset easily because of this. They have trouble being organized and keeping their things together. They're very easily distracted, and sometimes they even have problems with remembering to do things. So the other thing is specific learning disorder, and this accounts for about half of the population of our SPED kids that we have. And one reason being is because specific learning disorder is not unique in the area that it can affect. It can affect reading, math, writing, listening, attention, and just, I'm just kind of trying to think of the other one that I had in my mind. Writing. Did I say writing? Okay. But anyway, it can affect one of 8 areas and be diagnosed as such. And really what SLD is the unexpectedness that you find when you're trying to help this child learn something and they cannot get it. After numerous times of doing sometimes the same thing over and over, maybe trying a different method and then trying something else, and they still could not get it. And so you keep telling yourself, but I don't understand why. So it is unexpected, and research has shown that specific learning disorder can also be attributed to memory, mental flexibility, and which is kind of like being flexible with your thinking, being fluid, and being able to think about things that are one way and then, swapping over and thinking about something a different way. And then processing speed also has something to do with it. So what's the answer? What can we do? Well, why do, some people may ask, well, why is this important? Well, because psychosocial development is what makes us who we are. It involves what we're born with. It involves the environment, but you become who you are. Your personality, how you interact with your classmates and your family, who you grow up to be. Are you a responsible adult? Are you still kind of stuck in that teenage years, and you don't want to get a job, or you're not ready for that yet? I mean, all of those things have to do with psychosocial development. And so if you are a person that's affected by these types of neurological deficits, then your development as a person and as an adult, you may keep coming to walls after walls after walls that you have to keep knocking down. So that's why it's important to research these things and learn about them and try to come up with ways that we can help our kids. So some of the research that I found focused on helping specifically these individuals with these neurological deficits and how we can make their life better or different or have more of a positive effect on them. Other things that I looked at were just treatments for psychosocial developmental delays, and then other kinds of research that I looked at were it's where researchers wanted to find out where these things come from, like what causes it, or is there a reason why this child is like this? Is it genes or is it the environment? So the first set of studies that I looked at were about studying twins, and it showed that to date that the estimates of autism are between 70 and 80%, that you will inherit or get autism from a family member, like you inherit it. That's kind of how I have to think about it. And that siblings that have siblings with autism are more likely to have autism themselves or to have characteristics like autism. Now the eye tracking techniques, that was like a technique that they have recently been able to use to work with autistic kids to see if they do in fact have some kind of reliable judgment. That in the past, kids with autism have found to be unreliable in their judgment of people and people's actions. But, when children are nonverbal and maybe even too young to explain what's going on in their head, you want to find a way that you can do that. So they use eye tracking techniques to do this. And the person would just lay in a chair or something and look at a screen, and then that screen has a camera looking at your eyes, tracking the movement of your eyes. So they could tell what the child was looking at, how long they spent looking at it, whether it was the person or the object in the picture. And then they also looked at the emotional response that the children were giving to the pictures, and found out that children with autism can make appropriate judgments when they're asked to determine the mental state of the person. For example, if that person meant to harm the other person or was it an accident. This was like a method that we could use as therapy for kids that have psychosocial development delays, such as children with intellectual disabilities. What they did is they took two groups of kids. One had intellectual disabilities and the other one didn't. And they taught the kids with the group of kids without intellectual disabilities about people with intellectual disabilities. So these kids were more apt to spend time and want to spend time and to understand kids or people that had intellectual disabilities. And they found this to be a positive thing. They taught them before the soccer team was put together, and then they put one kid without intellectual disabilities with a kid that didn't have it as a peer group, and they had found positive effects for the kids without disabilities and the ones with. This is also another method of like a therapy, and psychosocial stimulation is where you take something that's like you have a situation and you want to do something to improve the situation. So, for example, if a child is not being taken out of their home environment and they're not being exposed to something, then you try to find a way to bring whatever that is into their home. So that's what they essentially did with these mothers, is they brought things into the home to stimulate the children socially, so they could make gains in their social development. Well, they found that as long as the lessons were going on, they were having a positive effect. But once they stepped away and those lessons were not being continued, that there was no growth for the children. Okay, this one was more like an observation of different groups of children. They wanted to know which home environment would help children develop socially and which ones maybe had a negative effect. And they had choice between, well, all of them were 24-hour care, but there was a family group, a residential group, and then foster care. So all of them were being taken care of 24 hours a day. And they found that 1 in 5 children with psychosocial developmental problems actually improved their behavior when placed in a 24-hour care setting. But they also had like something kind of surprising, that they found that development was comparable between children placed in family groups and children placed in residential facilities, whereas a lot of times you think of residential facilities as being more of a negative thing. And now maternal weight, that affected kids in a negative way socially. Social difficulties, when your kid's exposed to media too much, that affects them negatively. So for psychosocial development versus achievement, this was a study done by a group that they wanted to know how the learning achievement of autistic children was affected by the psychosocial development and the nutritional status. So what they did is they took surveys, and then they went through the surveys and kind of divided all of the kids into groups based on, you know, their responses. And they found that autistic children that had good psychosocial development actually were able to adapt their abilities when they were doing simple activities, when they were when they needed to be independent and work alone, when they were playing with friends, or when they were trying to just understand what somebody was trying to say to them. So basically, if they had psychosocial development and it was good, then they were able to do these things. But on the other hand, if they had deficits in their psychosocial development, they were not able to do these things. And so they wanted to find out, you know, what were the differences, because I think in general, autistic kids are just looked at as not being able to be this one way, like almost like cookie cutter. And these researchers, you know, were wanting to kind of prove that wrong and to say that we need to start looking at kids with autism as different. You know, we need to be looking at them individually to see what they can and what they can't do, and just stop putting them in a group altogether. And then this is the last thing that I come across, the effects of processing speed. So whenever you give an IQ test of some kind, a lot of times you can figure out what the processing speed is of the person, you know, of the patient or the client. And they're starting to figure out that processing speed has a lot to do with specific learning disabilities, and that the level of your processing speed is attributed or associated with kids that have social developmental delays, and they also can also be they're not adequate, is what I'm trying to say. They're not adequate in their abilities to communicate and socialize with people, with other people or their peers. They have like a lag in figuring out things and being able to respond to the situation that they're in. And there's more the group of children that had specific learning disabilities and processing speed deficits were more impacted. Like, they had a greater number of deficits that they had to overcome compared to the kids who just had some working memory issues and are none at all. So these three are executive subtypes. So the processing speed was the one that they had more problems with, behavior and being cognitively aware and being able to understand what's going on and being able to socially adjust to situations. Okay, that was it. Thank you for listening.